This is Morrison Wealth Wellbeing's first virtual panel discussion. We are looking at Ask the Experts, navigating the financial and legal COVID-19 minefield. So to introduce myself, my name is Anna Findlay and I manage operations within Morrison Wealth Wellbeing. For those who might not be familiar with us, Morrison Wealth Wellbeing work with organisations to provide financial education for their employees as part of their wellbeing strategy. We also provide roundtables for the HR community to discuss relevant topics and provide networking opportunities. And within the session, we wanted to do something just a little bit different. So we've got Tony on board and also Michael, and both of those are experts who are going to be sharing their legal and financial knowledge with us and answering questions today. They will further introduce themselves in a moment, but just in terms of structure for today, the session will begin with a look at complexities around furlough. As we know, there are changes that keep coming through with regards to furlough, so I know there are new questions and things that people want confirmed and information about. And then we'll also look to move along to some wider thoughts around going back to work and what the new normal might look like. There will also be the chance for questions at multiple points, so if you can utilise the chat function throughout, that will be helpful. So I think, Tony, if you could get us started just on a bit of an introduction to yourself and maybe give us an insight into how you found lockdown so far as well.
Right, what a good question. Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I wouldn't class myself as an expert. I always think that a friend of mine way back said, break the word down into two. X is a has-been, spur is a drip under pressure. So keep that very much in mind. Very briefly, director of St James's Place, but managing director of Technical Connection, which is a tax legal consultancy consulting to the financial services sector. Predominantly on tax, legal, financial planning matters. Our business was acquired by St James's Place to beef up their legal and tax function a few years back. And I've just taken quite an interest in this. It does have an element of taxation, but I think when you say you're a tax, legal, financial planning specialist, then because this involves a bit of everything, all of those things, we had a Venn diagram, tax, legal and financial, plus all the HR stuff, more important HR stuff and contractual stuff, all comes together. So I think you probably get the best out of this with a mix of contributions, which is what we're hoping to do today from the legal, tax, financial, and hopefully just general good sense standpoint. So that's me. Lockdown so far, it's been all right, really. I don't think if you can get outside and there's been a bit of sunshine and you're not cooped up in a flat, fortunately not having to look after, 2 or 3 kids, it must be immensely difficult, incredibly pressure giving. And so I'm pretty fortunate. And we are all in it together, but it affects all of us so differently. This whole thing about the great equaliser, we won't get all political, is utter rubbish, basically. But, my normal's been all right. I can't really complain, to be honest. Thanks for asking, Hannah.
Yeah,
and I think for all of you too, actually.
And I think as well, that's why we wanted to just help our HR colleagues and just provide some support, because I think we're aware that under normal circumstances, this isn't necessarily what we would normally do, but we know that our HR colleagues are getting the brunt of this at the moment, and actually providing some support and help is something that we're really keen to do in this field. So I think if we start having a look at some of the questions, because I know that we've got some that are very financial based, and I think the first thing we were going to look at was what kind of assistance has the government made available, because I know that there have been a raft of different bits of information that are out there around just generally what the government are providing, and I think it might be useful just to kind of give an overview of what kind of support people can expect from a financial perspective.
Yeah, and I'll keep it brief because we could go on. This has grown exponentially. It's like that mile a minute creeping vine. It's just and it just goes mad. You can remember way back just after lockdown when the Chancellor made that incredible announcement of the support that was going to be given. It was very succinct and very short. And since then, the amount of content that is available, if you want to search for it, but both at its source from the government, which has been, I think, incredibly detailed and very clear, and the tools that they've built and the calculators they've built, and then the incredible commentary that's been given around an analysis from the different sectors and the professional bodies in those sectors, from HR, CBI, government bodies, and then you've got the tax and legal community, all giving great insight. So I think you shouldn't be short of getting an answer to your question, thanks to good old Google or whoever you go and speak to. Broadly, I break the assistance down into three broad parts. I go grants, loans and tax deferment, broadly speaking. Grants have got by far the most publicity because, the job retention scheme and the furlough payment that's made to the employer, really, but I won't do the details, we'll get questions on that later, is to the employer. And there was a misunderstanding, I think, early on that employees thought, oh, I'll get that payment from the government. I think, no, there's this nexus between you and your employer, the employer and the government. The government compensates the employer for continuing to pay you broadly. And then the self-employment grant, which happily has been extended for another 3 months, because that was lagging a bit, and we only got that news last week. I know there's a question on that. Both of those payments are taxable, more questions. And then you've got the grants that aren't, which relate to your premises largely and go substantially towards the hospitality and entertainment industry, but not exclusively. If you're a small business and pay business rates or could pay business rates, but for small business rates relief, then that one-off grant of 10, 25, that can be incredibly valuable. So, but there are, in all of these things, and then the deferment is the thing that gets missed a lot. If you just, your self-assessment returns, your VAT payments, just don't pay them. I know it seems like I'm getting all Martin Lewis. You just don't have to pay. There's not even an application. VAT due up to June, just don't pay. Submit your return, just don't pay it. And if you had that money in good housekeeping sense, ready to pay the government, then that is a kind of loan to yourself. And there's no interest, no penalties, and you'll get told sort of the mechanism for repaying in January. So that's useful too. And also, I'll leave it with the time to pay scheme. You can, call, you always could, but even more so now, call HMRC and say, I'm struggling, it is going to cause a problem. They're much more open to listening these days. You will have to have a business plan and say why and when you plan to pay this back and all of that, but don't forget that either. So as I said, loans, grants, deferment. That's what I break it down into.
And being sensible, as you said, with how you're actually spending that money when it does need to be spent, I think. So that's a really good message.
So much of that with the loans as well. Obviously, a loan, it clues in the name, does have to be repaid. So that's the other thing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And I think we've also got Michael on board now, so I'm just going to jump over to Michael for a moment. Sorry, Michael, I had just popped you on mute there. We've done a short introduction and introduced Tony, so it'd be good if you could just do the same yourself, Michael, and just give us an introduction, short introduction into your background, and also how you're finding lockdown. Tony's just given us a bit of a personalised approach there, so it'd be good if you could do the same. Thank you, Michael.
I can do that. I'm not on mute anymore. Hello, everybody. My name's Michael Milne. I'm a barrister. I run a firm called Elisi, which means the solution in Greek, and we offer expert legal compliance advice. And the areas we specialise in is data protection, including GDPR and data protection officer roles, employment law, health and safety, fire risk assessments. And on the health and safety front, we also get involved with construction health and safety, including the CDM regulations. I can go into a little bit more as to what we do within all of those. Very briefly, we undertake audits of compliance. We write legally compliant policies and procedures. We create forms and record-keeping systems. We deal with the regulators on clients' behalf. And we also provide a telephone and email quick response facility to our retained clients. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, how are you finding lockdown? How are you personally? How are you finding it from a personal perspective?
I'm very lucky. I live in the wilds of the country, 3/4 of a mile off road, and I've been rather enjoying it, to be perfectly honest with you. The gardens never looked so good. I've never been so fit. The dog is as happy as Larry. And but on a more serious note, it's been a challenging time, but hopefully we'll get through it, and then we'll be in a position to help people as and when they need it.
Brilliant, and that's what I was saying to Tony. That's I think our aim for today is just to provide that little bit more help and support. So I think if we move on to some of the questions that we've had in, I think the first one we've got there is around about employees completing basic admin and volunteering. Now, obviously, I know that there's new rules in terms of part-time working that have now potentially come in as well, which have maybe slightly muddied the waters here.
Yeah.
But it would just be interesting to get your thoughts on this.
Once that we got complete clarity on the part-time, that's obviously going to change the situation from the outset. Has been, if they're furloughed, they can't work, and they certainly can't work for the organisation that's furloughed them. And even if it's called in a voluntary capacity, that's been quite clear. People have been able to volunteer for other roles outside of the organisation. That's been okay, but not working itself or themselves for the organisation. Essentially, furlough was to avoid redundancies and to protect employment. And once you're furloughed and you're saying, okay, we're putting you to one side here, then you can't work and furlough at the same time.
Okay. Thank you. And I think you've mentioned redundancy issues there as well. How, because I think that is a kind of a difficult subject as well for employers at this point in time, as to how they handle redundancies and how that works alongside the furlough rules, I think.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a fair amount of bloodletting. Some of it will be inevitable because of reorganisation, which will be unfortunate. Some of it will be because it may suit organisations to take that route. Irrespective, the redundancy procedures and rules will still apply. That won't change insofar as how they have to go about it. One interesting point, and we have had clarity from HMRC on this, is that if people are being made redundant and there is notice pay involved, that notice period can include or be covered in part, if not in all, by the furlough scheme. Now, this was very contentious at one stage, but I have seen a conversation, I've got documentary conversation between a client of mine and HMRC on this very point, and they've said that point, and it was confirmed. Now, that's evidential. Now, whether or not that is how the HMRC are likely to see it going forward, I don't know, but that's a current situation that I'm aware of.
And I think that you brought up a really good point there, that I think HMRC are having to provide a lot of guidance, I think, on the go with people at the moment, because it's not necessarily something that all these rules are new to them as well. And I think at this point, Tony, it's probably useful if we look at the kind of tax implications for furlough payments, because obviously these are being paid out, as you said, by the employer, but might not necessarily be coming from the government as such. So there probably is some kind of tax implication there, I would suspect.
Yeah, definitely. If you consider the flow and the employer pays the employee, then that's just like any salary payment. So it's PAYE-able, national insurance-able, all of that, as if it's a payment. It's just you're not doing any work for it. And then the employer reclaim on the other side from, or the grant that's given by HMRC to the employer is also taxable. So coming into the business, tax to corporation tax or income tax, depending on what the business is. So that should be neutral, because you've got money coming in, oh, that's taxable, but you've got a deductible expense for the payment out that you make to your employee. The employer can also reclaim, currently anyway, and continually out to August, the national insurance and the any auto enrolment contributions or an equivalent amount can also be reclaimed, and that's on top of the maximum furlough repayment, which is 2,500, as we know at the moment. Just an interesting point in terms of that, when it all comes to the end, and the point Michael made, really important point about redundancies, and we're reading a lot of that, and is it just pent up and we're just waiting for this to happen? Just an FT story yesterday was carrying that France are talking, not that we are in Europe, but you know what they do, but France have said we're looking to extend our payment, our scheme, the unemployed scheme, for 2 years, and they pay up to 80 to 100% of salary at lower pay then. And Germany doing the same, considering continuing. So I know the Chancellor said it comes to an end in October, but I think so much at play that you couldn't utterly rule out some form of continuing support. I wouldn't encourage people to sort of rely on that, but it's clearly discussions being had because of the bigger picture of what it means to have so many people unemployed and the cost of that as well, compared to continuing to pay something towards them as opposed to unemployment pay. Just a thought.
Yeah, and I think that's really important as well that you mentioned the auto enrolment and national insurance, because I think there was some question initially as to whether those would still be included as part. Would employers still have to pay them and employees still receive them? And I think also you've got things like the apprenticeship levy and all of those kind of things as well. And again, this gets muddied slightly further, but as we said with Michael, with the new part-time rules, because potentially that's going to complicate the process in how that works for people that only work part-time.
You need to segment, don't you? Yeah, you need to segment. When you do work, you get paid for that as the employer's responsibility to pay it up to your contractually, in the amount you're contractually entitled to, and the furlough bit applies to the bit that you're not working. Remember that NIC, if I didn't make that clear enough, that NIC and auto-enrolment equivalent minimum payment that you can reclaim from the government ceases in August. So that was, you still get the furlough payment as the employer, the grant, but you can't claim the NIC, the employer's NIC and the auto-enrolment contribution minimum from August. That ceases then.
Yeah.
The other thing with notice pay, should somebody decide to have that notice falling into a furlough payment period, is that the employer is obliged to make up to 100% of what their, the notice pays the full amount, not the 80%, as it were. So even if the firm wasn't topping up, as it were, with notice pay and holiday pay, they do have to top up.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question around how is holiday and maternity and all the kind of standard leave affected, because obviously that is it's all things that we're used to doing as employers, and employees are used to taking this time, but how would this be affected as part of the COVID-19 and furlough and all of that area?
All of the statutory entitlements will carry on through, basically. The holiday entitlement has changed because the working time regulations have been updated to reflect the COVID crisis, and people can push that forward over 1 or indeed 2 years, rather than normally at the end of the year. If statutorily, if the holiday isn't taken, then it's lost. But that won't apply at the moment.
And how does that work in terms of people with contracts that don't allow for that to roll over? Because I think that's been a question that we've had, certainly, to say that obviously the government has said potentially that will roll over, but how does that work if you contractually you're told that your holiday is within that 1 year period and you don't get it, you can lose it if you don't use it?
Because it's a good question, actually, because a contract of employment cannot offer terms that are worse than the statute. So if the statute is saying that it's changed, then the contract of employment can't offer a worse deal. In other words, it can't chop it off. It can always offer a better deal. It's a bit like saying that you'll give extra notice pay or you'll give an enhanced redundancy payment, but it can't go the other way. So it'll be interesting to see how that one actually plays out. But because the working time regulations have been updated rather than just a guidance, as it were, then my understanding would be that is then the new statute, and therefore that would apply.
And I think then that goes on to the point around what happens if then people are being told they need to take holiday this year, because I assume employers won't necessarily want them to carry it over, so they're being asked to take it this year, and then potentially any legal blowback from that, because I know of companies personally that I have friends who work and have said you have to take that time or some of that time.
Yes, what will happen in that instance, the same piece of legislation the working time regulations stipulate, is an employer can tell an employee that they want them to take holiday at a particular period, a bit like the Christmas work shutdown, which is quite normal now. But what the regulations say is an employer has to give an employee 2 days notice for every 1 day of holiday. So if they want them to go off for a week, then they've got to give them essentially 2 weeks notice, 10 days, if we're taking a standard 5-day week. So they can do that. Now, I had one recently where they just extended the furlough by a further 3 weeks, the extra accounting period, and they told them at the beginning of that, right at the beginning, that they wanted them to take the third of those 3 weeks as holiday, and they would be entitled to do that under the working time regulations.
Okay, so the answer is if you really do want your employees to take it, you just have to comply with those regulations. But otherwise, potentially, you will be looking to move them into the following year in terms of the guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, an employer can arguably tell an employee exactly when they want them to take holiday throughout a year. To be perfectly honest with you, I mean, it doesn't work like that in reality, in practicality. But you know, that's how the regulations are set out. And then similarly, the employee would have to give a certain amount of notice to an employer wishing to have holiday. So it applies both ways in that respect.
Yes, yeah. And I think at this point it's really interesting that a lot of this stems on the kind of legal and financial, in some respects, requirements and things being updated, and all of these rules are kind of new, and nobody is potentially sure how to put them into place. So I think this is why we have to be really clear on how they're actually approached. I think, Tony, you mentioned the 2,500 salary cap. And I think that even to some extent we've had questions around, is that gross or is it a net figure? Because this is so new for everybody that they're not entirely sure how to apply some of this.
Yeah, so the rule currently is the employer must pay at least 80% of the salary up to a maximum of 2,500 and can reclaim up to 80% 2,500, and that's a gross figure, not net of tax. That's that sort of those limits are gross. Of course, that starts to drop in terms of what the employer can reclaim from September, because that drops to 70% of the pay with I have to remind myself of the maximum, but it drops to 70% of the pay with a cap of 218,750 for September, then dropping to 60% with a cap of 1875. But the employer still needs to pay to qualify for that furlough payment compensation grant, as it were, from HMRC. Still needs to pay 80% of salary up to 2,500 to the employer. Hence, their contribution will be a 10% contribution to make up the 80%, 70 from the government via the employer, 10 from the employer, and then 60 from the government plus 20 from the employer to make it up in October, when, as I said, ostensibly the scheme ends. But watch this space, dependent on the economy, shape of recovery, all of that. And we will have a budget this year. It seems almost certain now, especially reading the weekend press, that we won't have an emergency summer budget. I mean, the emergency bit seemed a bit odd, in that the one thing you don't want is to leap into and take action before you've got all of the information. We've heard all of that with being led by the science. So I think this is, budgets are led by the economy, I think, really. So we'll wait and see what it looks like before taking action.
Yeah,
on what tax looks like and benefits and all the rest of it.
And I think that's probably what is especially hard, I think, is that for, I suppose, planning for larger businesses in some ways is easier, whereas for small and medium businesses, this is all a lot of uncertainty. And for them, how the tax is treated for people who are shareholding directors of small businesses, how all of this relates to them can be quite difficult, because it's trying to keep a small business or a medium business going whilst also trying to navigate all of these kind of rules.
Very much so. And as I mentioned at the top of this programme, there are gaps. And I think, the Chancellor said, with all best intent, we'd love there not to be, but this is being developed, as you said, Hannah, this legislation on the hoof to some extent. So there will inevitably be gaps that, in the normal sense, would be picked up at the next budget and another finance act, and all of that, they'd be picking up the gaps and plugging them, but that isn't possible now. And the SME director, the owner managers, there's been a lot of publication of commentary around that and the gap that they had in the, one of these, as Michael mentioned, one of the key conditions for furlough is that you can't work for the employer. So if you're the owner manager of a small business and you're a key contributor to the success of that business, you can't, furlough yourself. You might think of yourself as self-employed, but you're not, because under the self-employed scheme, you can continue working, although you have to prove your business has been detrimentally affected by COVID, but you can't actually work. And then there's been a lot of uncertainty. If you're a director, you do have statutory responsibilities as a shareholder. Can you perform those to create work? Well, the government said you can't do any sort of work that that generates income, that generates revenue for them. So there's been uncertainty, but I think most SME directors would have continued to work to keep the business going and therefore unable to claim furlough. Now they'll be maybe helped by the temporary or flexible furlough conditions that commence from July, so they could do a bit of work and claim a bit of furlough. Remember, it's only up to the maximum that exists. It's one of those areas of complexity for smaller businesses. And the ones that have really suffered, I guess, are those sole trader type businesses that have traded through a company, the IR35 thing, and they felt, I think, maybe with some justification that they've been got at because they've fallen through the biggest gap, which is they're not self-employed, they can't carry on working, they can't get anything. They don't have a premise, they work in a WeWork place, so they can't get the grant, nothing, apart from maybe applying to the local authority for some kind of emergency grant.
And I think IR35 is a whole separate subject to itself, isn't it? I think that's a whole other, which has obviously been pushed out further into the year now as we would expect with everything that's happened. But
so many things that were big subjects of discussion have been sort of pushed back for consideration because COVID has been, and everything around it's been so all-consuming.
Yeah, where everyone's just got their concentration on Brexit. Yeah. What about Brexit, blimey?
Aside from the Premier League, come on.
And I think it's an interesting point that you raised there as well around what can and can't be done via furlough. And I think, Michael, it's an interesting point to pick up because we've had questions around grievance procedures, for example, and how that works for people that are on furlough. Because obviously, if you've had grievances that are in progress, how can people witness? Can people still follow those procedures whilst in furlough, for example?
I think the answer to that is yes, but it's not going to be easy or straightforward. Certainly ACAS have issued guidance on this very topic, and it could be done via this forum, for example, or Zoom or whoever. I think people have to be quite careful how they go about that, because it's obviously people will be worried that that there could be a kind of hijacking element going on and so on and so forth. I would say if it's possible to avoid it until it can be done in the normal way, that probably would be better. But it doesn't stop it from being done through these kind of forums. But obviously, with any kind of disciplinary and grievance, people should follow the ACAS code quite carefully. It's mercifully short, to be perfectly honest. It's a 16-page document. I mean, it is not a difficult thing to negotiate. And if people follow it, they're going to find themselves in a far better position, and make sure that they tell people in advance what it is that, if it's a disciplinary, what they're being, for want of a better word, accused of, what the possible outcomes could be that they do have. They can bring or introduce, as it were, a work colleague or a trade union representative, etc., etc. So there's no real reason why these things can't be done that way. And certainly, there's certainly one of these forums that offer a transcription service of the conversations, or indeed just to say in advance of the conversation, is everyone happy to have this recorded, which makes things much easier, certainly evidentially as to who said what. And then obviously the usual thing about providing any evidence in advance, any witness statements, so on and so forth. So people have to be, careful. But as I say, there is specific guidance on this available on the ACAS website.
And I think it's probably also important to realise, I suppose, the actual personal human aspect, that these kind of procedures are difficult in office, and actually if you've got someone who's going through that and they're at home and there's potentially family walking around, then it's probably they're just being slightly more human and conscious of those kind of things as well, that people are not, they're in their home environment whilst you're trying to deal with all of those kind of subjects.
In a way, the proper procedure would be to do some kind of risk assessment in advance of doing this. I mean, for larger organisations, they would be geared to assessments in that way. For smaller organisations, it might not cross their mind that such a thing could be done by a risk assessment. But it would be a good idea, and then that will extend going into the future for home working, which will become more prevalent, and so on and so forth. So systems, policies and procedures will just get ever more important, you know.
Yeah. And I think also, as Tony's been saying, I think looking at the future could be a different way of working. And I think we're now having questions around furlough in terms of, can people be put on and put off? Because potentially companies are trying to work out how the future looks, and it's quite hard to see whether they want a certain group or certain people on an extended furlough, or actually whether they can take them off furlough and then put them back on again if required. And I think that's definitely something that is available, but obviously it just probably makes the background administration more complex, I would assume.
And even more reason to do assessments in advance of changing the MO, as it were, of disciplinary and grievance procedures. I mean, it's a good opportunity to be able to do things in a different way, but it does have to be carefully looked at.
And I think the one of the things I think it has started to come up now, the more we talk about the new normal and looking to the future, is what happens if people don't want to go back to work, because potentially people have got comfortable with being at home, or they are still not, for health reasons, wanting to go back to work. And I think, what do you think in terms of how that looks for companies who have to have those discussions with their employees?
There's two pieces of legislation that are going to feed into the answer here. One is the Health and Safety at Work Act, because obviously employers are obliged to provide a safe environment. And then the second is the Employment Rights Act 1996, which is a rather large document. But for those of you that want to look it up, Section 44 deals with this. And if an employee feels that the working environment is unsafe, they can refuse to go into it. Now, the thing is, where the rub is, if you like, is that they have to have a reasonable belief. So what does reasonable mean? So that's where the argument, if you like, will come in. I think it's a good idea. If somebody says, look, I don't feel that it's a safe environment, then I think an employer should say, well, why don't you? And what evidence is that based upon? Also, as employers get back to work and they do their own risk assessments on a COVID-19 risk assessment, that they obviously share that with all of their employees, indeed make the employees part of that process. And then they're going to be in a far better position. But it's to say that an employee can't refuse would be wrong, but it's not equally to say, yeah, you can refuse, don't worry about it, just do whatever you like. That would be wrong as well. So it's far more nuanced than that.
Yeah. And there's, as you said, there's kind of towing the line between what the rules and regulations are, but also keeping your employees engaged and on board, which I'm assuming is quite a difficult line in some cases.
A client of mine very recently had exactly this thing. Somebody said they didn't want to come back to work. They weren't happy. They didn't think it was a safe environment. The company had done a risk assessment. They had sent it to all their people. And I said, can you ask your employee to put in writing their objection, the reasons for their objection, and as much information as possible as to why they've arrived at that? And the outcome was, India, they were quite happy to come back. It just went through a relatively short process. I think that they were more, it would appear in this circumstance, they really actually quite like staying at home, which is, understandable on one hand, but not very helpful for the employer on the other. So I would just always go for the evidence, get the evidence, get it in writing, and then you can start having a proper dialogue rather than just reacting to somebody saying, well, I don't want to, I don't think it's safe.
Okay, yeah, I think that's very sensible. And I think I'm just going to remind the attendees at this point that if you want to use the chat function, you can ask questions of both Tony and Michael as well. We'll be moving on now, I think, to a bit more around what the future might look like, and what kind of considerations we need to think about going forward. But if there are any specifics around furlough and the financial requirements and tax implications, please do feel free to pop those into the chat, and then obviously I will route those through. So I think, Tony, we spoke a little bit around what as you said, businesses can do in terms of being clever, I suppose, is a good example for managing their money at the moment through coronavirus, and in terms of what might be maybe good housekeeping. Have you got any suggestions in terms of ways in which companies can think about money coming in, money going out, and be that little bit more maybe clever around where they're actually paying out funds at the moment?
Yeah, I think as this is evidence, and having been an SME owner for many, many years, cash is king, cash flow is essential, and it's, profit is one thing, but having the money is another, especially at a time like this. So I think a priority for most businesses will be maximising retained cash. So being careful about, so apart from the general good housekeeping about not spending stuff on extravagances and all the rest of it, which I won't patronise people by saying, when you look at what's available to you and what you don't have to pay out if you don't want to and aren't penalised for it and aren't breaking the law, and what you can get in, those two things, there's been an awful lot of change, which we've referred to quite a bit of that change already. But if you look at the coming in part, make sure that you do a full assessment and look at what you're entitled to. It's been the same for many years. Just make sure you get what you're entitled to. And there's an awful lot, of complexity around it. And there might be some situations where there's not everybody who's claimed by any means, everybody who could claim has claimed some of these things. So look at what you can get by way of grant. Look at what you can get by way of loans. If it comes, grants are best because you don't have to pay them back. Obviously, grants are even better if they're not taxable, because then you get to keep more of what you get. So furlough, self-employment scheme, taxable, but nevertheless get them if you're entitled to them for as long as you can. The claims procedure seems to be going really well. The portals work well. You'll always hear stories of, it took me ages and all the rest of it, but on the whole, payments are coming through quite quickly. It seems, within days of making claims. And then once you're in, as it were, that the changes for and the continuation of the job retention scheme, by the way, which takes it through to October, you need to have been a claimant up to the end of June. If you weren't a claimant in June, then new claimants won't be permitted. It's basically a continuation for those that have been claiming, by the way. So get your money in. Grants, definitely, if you can, apply from those, largely through local authorities, but funded by the government. And as I mentioned, that kind of self-grant where you don't have to pay the tax, it's more of a way of a loan to yourself, not paying VAT. If it helps you, if you've got the money and you can pay it, then pay it. But if you've got the money and don't need, and it would help you to not have it, then there's some money, there's some cash. No interest, no penalties. Same for your self-assessment return. Not the same provisions for corporation tax, but you can talk to the revenue under the time to pay scheme to work something out for them, provided you've got a decent business plan. And lastly, the loan on the input side, the inflow side, there are the loan schemes. Initially, the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. We've got so many new acronyms, the CBILS scheme. And then what's attracted much more attention was the more recently introduced bounce back loan scheme between 2 and 50,000 on amazingly attractive terms, but it is still a loan. But the requirements for getting the loan in terms of business plan, repayment period are incredibly thin. So you'll get the loan and it's 100% guaranteed by the government. You'll have no interest on it, no need for capital payments for a year, no interest for a year, no capital payments for a year, and 2.5% after that, up to 6 years. Credible terms and very quick to get. So that flow has been good too. And then on the other side, as I said, just do what you can to stem the flow outwards, and especially stuff that's permissible if it helps you, and the tax deferment arrangements are useful to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think is there anything that people, I think maybe going forward, might want to think about as a business, because obviously this is something completely you can't really kind of protect yourself for this, but going forward, has it given maybe any lessons from a financial perspective in terms of things that businesses could look at to protect themselves financially? I suppose maybe in terms of cash reserves or even for financially protecting your company and your business. Is there anything you can suggest?
It's really difficult, that one, because certainly for all of us as individuals as well as sort of business owners, for individuals, many of us will see, I'd certainly look at that, and you'll look at your credit card statement and go, oh, I actually haven't spent anything. There's the way of, so that's a temporary thing. But I think businesses will probably initially some businesses will call into question the need for not premises at all necessarily, but in some cases, yeah, but as much premises. If they were thinking of moving, do we need that much office space? You know, the use of technology, we're all now Zoom aficionados or WebEx or Teams, all of that. So I think that it will definitely come into play, the way in which people work and working from home, less travel costs, better for the environment too. All of that will definitely have an impact on cost. In terms of the financial protection, and I think what the current environment has taught us is, and we're seeing horrific figures of the amount of the same as individuals, the rainy day money, if you like, that businesses carry is so little that it keeps them going for a month. And that's all that there was in reserves. And we've seen it in spades, obviously, with the airlines when they've got incredible expenses. But you go, actually, nothing coming in. Oh, that's all right. We've got some money in the bank. Yeah, but that goes within such a short period when you still have the expenses. So, without being patronising, have some money in reserve and invest it wisely and make it accessible and minimise the tax on it. And then there's that whole point as we are as individuals. It's not quite the same for businesses, but making sure, God forbid, should anything happen to you, and of course, if you're the business owner or anyone that's key to that business, the loss of that individual for whatever reason, serious illness or death for any cause, it's just makes you think a little more around, if God forbid that were to happen, do I have enough protection for my family or for my business?
Yeah.
We also sort of think of as my family. So basic life insurance. I mean, the government, their eternal credit, also brought in that sort of death in service for frontline workers, anyone working on the front line, just literally anyone in care, social and NHS care. That £60,000 payment that will be made should death be caused due to COVID caught whilst performing your duties. Another just sort of, that's fantastic. Is it enough? A family of 2 or 3, is that enough money? So the whole thing of basically financial good sense and provision, really. Things like this just cause us to sit. It's like when you see an accident and you drive a bit more carefully. I think it's kind of that. Just think about good financial sense and planning.
Use it as a good chance to stop and review, perhaps.
Yeah.
Before we get back to
a little more time to do that as well. We certainly found that, definitely. The question level hasn't dropped in terms of, wills, intestacy, financial planning generally, pensions, withdrawing money from your funds. How should you take it best? Just at the time when maybe the values have gone down and the challenges that bring. So all of that, just being more aware of your finances is probably the message to take from that question.
Okay, thank you, Tony. And I think, Michael, we were talking alongside, I suppose, the financial side, the legal side. There's probably a lot of considerations that need to be taken into account when we think about what is going to happen, from increased working from home to even going back to the office, and I suppose even a point of data protection from if we're going to be taking medical or sensitive information from employees. So how do you think that will look? What do we need to be considering when we're looking at that kind of future view?
On a data protection front, yes, we've got the sensitive personal information, so anything to do with medical issues would come under that. So there are further considerations that an employer must take into account. There is a good guidance from the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, on what is personal data, including sensitive data, which is quite a handy document. And as far as I know, it's still available on the website. With home working becoming more and more prevalent, one of the most important policies that a company should have is a bring your own device policy. So that's for personal devices. Now, it's a good idea. Most companies should have them in the first place for mobile phones and tablets and laptops and so on and so forth. It will become even more relevant and prevalent with home working, and that must tie in with whoever the IT provider is from a security point of view, because data is going to be away from the workplace. So it's not difficult to get these policies or put them into practice, but it does need to be done. So keynotes for data would be sensitive personal data, as you mentioned, and bring your own device policies. From an employment law point of view, contracts of employment may well need to be updated to reflect the new working arrangements that companies are bringing into force, especially job descriptions. So companies are going to have to review their job descriptions, both in terms of where they're working from. Companies are also going to have to take into consideration more flexible working arrangements, because I think that's going to arise. For example, I live in a village which is just south of Gatwick Airport. Lots of people in this village commute to London, and quite a few of them have said, well, I'm never going to go back to a 5-day working week. In London, I'm going to do, split this 2 and 3, 3 and 2, or whatever have you. So even just the fundamental arrangements are going to change, and the contract should reflect it. And as I say, especially the job descriptions, because we're moving into new territory, people will want to know what's expected of them, how it works, how that line management function may or may not change, etc., etc. So I think it's going to be key. But if people are ahead of the curve as opposed to behind it, they're going to get great benefits out of this, because there'll be so much more time for people to work that they're not traveling, or driving or whatever have you. So good opportunities, I think.
And I suppose for businesses that can't do that for whatever reason, or are not willing to look down that route, what kind of considerations are they going to need for going back into the office? Because potentially, if you're, anything like us, we're in an office block normally in Canary Wharf, so things like social distancing in a shared lift are very difficult. So what kind of things can we think to look at for people going back into an office, and how does that work from a kind of perspective of social distancing and that kind of thing?
The government have issued, now I don't know if I can share this on the screen, or you can, if I open it on my computer, let me see if I can find they've done about half a dozen guidances on risk assessment, on back to work. I'll give you the areas that they've done the guidances, but they're really, really helpful. One's construction and outdoors, another one factories, plants and warehouses, laboratories and research facilities, office and contact centres. So all of these documents are about 30 pages. They go into a lot of detail about how people should look at these things. Going into other people's houses is another one. Restaurants currently offering takeaway, and then shops and branches, people with vehicles, delivery issues as well. So there's very comprehensive guidance that was issued, I think, on the 11th of this month. No, the 11th of last month, hardly the 11th of this month, by the government. So I would urge people within those particular areas, which pretty much covers most business areas, to look at that guidance and then do their risk assessments. It's going to make such a difference to them.
And I think it's then obviously communicating that, isn't it, to the employees, so that they are comfortable to come back. Is that you need to do all of the internal things, as you said, risk assessments, data protection, but then making sure your employees are aware of those policies, so that they then feel comfortable enough to come back and feel protected.
What I would suggest with a risk assessment procedure is that it's done in a draft form and then sent to all employees for them to comment on it, because it's very easy to miss something off. And then, you can get some employee feedback, make sure that they're part of the solution, as it were, and then you can have the final document rather than impose documentation or procedures on people. And one other thing that I'd recommend to people is that I have what I call it's a near-miss procedure. Now, normally this is used for avoiding accidents in the workplace. They're very common in construction, for example. But a near-miss is going to say where something almost happened but didn't, and then you can learn from it. And if you have a kind of near-miss procedure with COVID, in other words, you've got all of these socially distancing measures in place, and then all of a sudden you find there's 6 people in the lift and there shouldn't have been, that there's some kind of feedback to whoever's responsible so that they can then avoid that for the future. So I would always recommend it's a simple, very simple, super simple document to go along with your risk assessment.
And where do you stand on temperature testing? Because we've heard some news around companies sort of saying we're going to look to temperature test employees before they come back into the office or before they're allowed on the premises. Where does that stand from a legal standpoint? Because I can imagine that can be quite difficult in some respects.
Yes, there's again, there's guidance, specific guidance on temperature from the ICO. And also from the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, because also if you are going to use temperature testers, these devices that they hold up, it effectively is a surveillance device. So then you get the surveillance rules start to play into it. So again, with that one, I would go in the first place to the ICO on temperature checking, because that's sensitive personal information, of course, because it's medical information, and then also have a look at with the Health and Safety Executive, or if I may say so, in the first or last resort, however you want to look at it, have a word with me.
Thank you. And I think that's a really lovely end to, I think, the session today. We've not had any further questions other than the ones that I've filtered through to you. So I think, firstly, we would just love to say thank you to you both for just taking the time today to share your expertise. I am going to say it, Tony, because I think you are both experts in your fields, and you've provided us with a lot of things to think about, I think, today, just in terms of current, but also things to look forward to or think about in the future. And I think for the attendees, thank you for joining as well. We hope that you have found the session useful. We will be providing some further links and sources of information, which Michael and Tony have both been nice enough to actually say they will share with us. And also, whilst you're here, Morrington Wealth Wellbeing are running a free promotion at this point to provide a free financial education webinar to a limited number of organisations. The webinar will be provided by one of our financial experts and will cover topics such as the basics of financial planning and protecting yourself and your family's investments. So if you think that's something your employees would benefit from, then obviously please do get in touch, as our spaces are limited for that promotion. And I think finally, we will also be running another session in a couple of weeks' time, which will look further at the future, so reboarding, to look at what businesses can expect potentially coming in a little bit more detail, to build on the second half of our session today. So once again, thank you so much for your time, and stay safe. Enjoy the rest of your day.